And my fallback recording, I have to do that too. Right, perfect. So,
are you actually in a meeting? She's actually in a meeting. Your microphone's on it?
Oh, that's so cute. Yes. Lovely. So I'll have to look out for muting or unmuting people. So Fiona or Chris or Miguel, can you look, so we look out for each other and see whenever someone comes on and by mistake has a microphone on, so that we don't that we don't get disturbance just for the presentation, and then we have loads of times for questions. So welcome everyone. It's lovely to see you tonight, and this is International Women's Day. I'm really delighted. I think it's the first time we're doing a series of talks about achievements of women in engineering innovation, and today we have 4 talks. Miguel will introduce Flor Avelino's work, and Fiona will introduce Dina D'Ayala's work, and we are very happy that Dina could actually join in person. So if there are questions for Dina directly, then that's the time to ask. Next, then I will talk about Zaha Hadid, an architect, and finally Chris will talk about Doreen Massey. 4 amazing women, really worth knowing more about them and their work. And what I hope to do is just 8 minutes of a short introduction of their work, and with 2 minutes of immediate questions. And then after that, we have hopefully still more time to have a good discussions about overarching themes and observations and any questions we want to ask. So I'll stop sharing my screen, and please, Miguel, would you take over and introduce?
Hello, very gladly. Let me see. I hope are you seeing my slides?
Yes.
In that case, well, I want to start with Flor Avelino. You saw the brief. She just completed her PhD thesis 10 years ago, which feels like nothing. This is to say, she's starting her career in a way. She's not an established figure like other women that we are talking about tonight. But I think that it is important to pay attention as well to people who are already making a difference in the field. And also she has made a difference to me because she was publishing her thesis and her early papers just as I was getting started as a researcher. I would say that she was very formative for me. And she was quite an eye-opener to me about the field of sustainability transitions. She made me realize that my approach, and I dare to say that the dominant approach in the field 10 years ago, was very centered on the technology and was not paying enough attention to the structures of power. And well, she came and she said that, well, decisions that were affecting the life of millions were being led by the vision of elite visionaries. And sometimes we didn't stop to think, us as academics, what were we doing when we were taking the side of elite visionaries just because they were sustainable or smart or greener than everyone. But well, I should probably backtrack a bit. I said that she was making a big difference in the field of sustainability. And Flor Avelino would describe her discipline as transition studies, or more specifically as transition management. So I would like to begin by saying, what is a socio-technical transition? And I think that most people in this room already have a vague idea, or maybe a very good idea, or even a better idea than I have of what's a socio-technical transition. But just in case, I will quickly say that when we went from horses to petrol cars, that was a socio-technical transition. And that one was that happened in a way without management. Maybe Henry Ford would disagree, but I would say that it's a transition that happens mostly spontaneously. And then now that we are trying to go from the petrol car to the electric car, that is another transition, and one that we are trying to manage desperately. We really have tried to have a sense of control in this other socio-technical transition. And then now the next question is, how do we manage such an amazing thing as a transition, as leaving the car behind when our civilization is based on the car pretty much? And here, transition management would say that we make the transition one step at a time. This illustration is from the workbook of strategic niche management, which was all the rage some 10, 20 years ago when Flor Avelino was making her statements when I was getting started as a researcher. And as you can see in this illustration, the idea is that if you want to make radical change, you start small. You don't start by replacing the cars in the whole world. You start by making a smart, low carbon neighborhood, the ultra low emission zone in London, for example. And then from this ultra low zone, you have an ultra low city, then an ultra low region, then ultra low country, and then you have changed the whole socio-technical system. But somebody has to push that first domino. And in a way, Flora Avelino's question is, who gets to push the first domino? Because at that time, people were very concerned with how do we design this system of dominoes? And Flor Avelino was asking, what are the consequences in the long term on who gets to design this chain of dominoes? Now, back in 2009, Flor Avelino's thesis, Power in Transition, Empowering Discourses on Sustainability Transitions, had just been published. And now, 10 years later, 11 years later, it has been cited 151 times according to Google Scholar. If one looks at the articles that are making references to her doctoral thesis, one sees a who is who of transition studies. And 2 years ago, 2019, she led the Power and Politics sections of An Agenda for Sustainable Transitions Research, which was this article jointly written by 29 authors, which again was a who's who in the field of transitions. And this is why I wanted to talk about her today, because it took her 10 years to go from PhD students to being the one who sits in the big table where the agenda is being set. And I feel like I am talking a bit over my time, so I will rush over the remaining slides to say that she realized that a transition is very transformative. And it is very easy to say that if it's a transition to sustainability, it's automatically good. Because, well, it is sustainable. Who can say no to sustainability? And the problem is when we talk about smart cities, nobody wants to have a dumb city or a city that is not smart. So people think, smart cities, good idea, let's support it. Until people realize, because Flora Avelino has been asking, who is behind this? IBM and Cisco. When we say, let's decarbonize transport, this is a very positive goal, one that is for the people. Well, maybe the transport decarbonization is not profit driven, but Elon Musk, the CEO of Tesla, maybe he has a profit interest in this. Or the sharing economy. Who can be against sharing? And that's when she realized, when Flora Avelino says, people are playing games with what sustainability is. We say, we share, it is sustainable. But then Uber, Airbnb get behind this, and then we have to wonder, is sharing such a good thing? And that's when we have to decide that we cannot pretend this is good and post-political. We have to see at the politics of who we design these experiments. Now, you will notice that the sharing economy is not Avelino, it's with Mayer. And I want to say, good people work with other good people. This paper by Mayer and Avelino, Narratives of Change, is the one that I am obsessing about these days. And well, I think I will stop here because I am over my time, but I hope these slides will be circulated. To learn more, here are a few key papers by Avelino and by interesting people who are working with Flor Avelino. And I think we still have at least 1 minute or two for questions, hopefully.
Absolutely. We even have, I think, 3. So don't worry about that. That's been fantastic. Really nice. Thank you, Miguel. Cheers.
Thank you.
Inspirational. Really amazing. Does anyone have? Yeah. Sorry, Miguel.
Just that I thought it was inspirational. I feel that a young person that is just getting started. I mean, I am even more of a beginner, but I am not writing the who's who, setting the agenda for the whole field. And I feel that it is important to know that people can start making a difference now. We don't have to wait until they have their legacy. Maybe I will be mistaken. Maybe I'm betting on the wrong horse, but I don't think so. I feel that she has at least very influential to me already.
Do you know her personally?
Oh no, afraid not. And she wouldn't know me at all. I don't think she has ever referenced my works. Sniff, sniff. But no, I just thought that I have been working with her so much. I felt that with her papers so much that I felt it was. I wanted to talk about it when I heard about this opportunity to have a talk today.
Okay. Are there any immediate questions?
In that case, I guess we wait for the overarching questions and I set the floor.
Absolutely, that's fine too. We can go through and then have maybe 1 more minute to spare. Thank you so much, Miguel.
Thank you, everyone. See you in a moment.
You come back to Theo's work and
I'll
the
be back.
discussion. Yeah. Okay. And can you unshare your screen? And then Fiona, I'd like to invite you if you're ready.
Okay. Right. Slightly unreliable broadband, so apologies if I disappear in the middle of this.
Let's see.
Okay. And I've shared it as PowerPoint, which means I can't see any of you. Right. Yeah. I've got you back. Okay. Right. Okay. So thank you. Good evening, everybody, and especially good evening to Dina. I'm so pleased that you could join us because you've been an inspiration to me for a number of years, well before I ever got to meet you. So Professor Dina D'Ayala has been somebody who I know many people she knows, and throughout the early years of my career, people have said, oh, you should ask Dina that, or Dina will know that, or haven't you met Dina? And I eventually got to meet her a couple of years ago at a couple of events in London. But over the last few years, I've been finding much of her work in the papers that I've been reading. Oops, there we go, I've lost it. I'm going to take myself off camera in the hope that that gives a bit more bandwidth. So I've been meeting Dina's papers as I've been researching for my own PhD, which I'm still writing up. So much of the inspiration has been through paperwork, and I apologise for any mistakes in my pronunciation. So Professor Dina D'Ayala's career has been in building resilience. Her first degree and doctorate from the Universita degli Studi di Roma, La Sapienza, which is one of the most ancient universities in Rome and in Italy, in Europe, and has alumni including Maria Montessori, who was one of the first female medical graduates in Europe, and Enrico Fermi. And her thesis was on structural behavior of the Colosseum and trying to understand the impact of earthquake events on a heritage building. So after university, she carried on looking at earthquake impacts, developing damage level cumulative distribution vulnerability curves. And she started working with EEFIT, which is the Earthquake Engineering Field Investigation Team. So they were established in 1981, and they approach earthquake engineering in its broadest sense through structural behaviour, geological response, regulation and disaster management. And they investigate it in the field through direct observation and local knowledge to make sure that they gather perishable data immediately after earthquake events. So Dina participated in two missions in the last century, the Umbria March earthquake investigation in Italy in 1997, which had a moment magnitude of 5.9 and largely involved traditional buildings with stone masonry in an area renowned for its agriculture and tourism. There were multiple monitors locally, and there was a significant cultural loss. So this area includes Assisi and a series of events leading to cumulative damage. Just a couple of years after that, at Kocaeli in Turkey, there was another major earthquake with a moment magnitude of 7.4. And here there were many more in concrete and large areas of urban development with dense population. Okay, am I still okay? I'm sorry, I keep disappearing.
That's all right, don't worry. I think we still hear you quite all right.
Okay, thank you. So there were multiple monitors here also, which meant that there could be a very detailed investigation of just why there was such a high death rate from an earthquake that was part of a series, but there hadn't been many earthquakes for a couple of decades before. So following on from that second mission, Dina contributed to a paper which set down a challenge to earthquake engineering professionals. So the theme of International Women's Day this year is that choose to challenge. And this is a very specific challenge that Dina D'Ayala made with other earthquake engineers to look at building technologies, developing local initiatives, and ensuring that good governance was in place to ensure high standards of construction and hence avoid some of the tragedy that emerged in Turkey in 1999. Oops, it's not. So this is a list of the EEFIT missions that I could find to date. We're about 40 of them, starting with an impromptu mission to Belgium by Ed Booth in 1983, just because it was the first earthquake he could get to. And most recently, a remote mission using a drone to understand the impact in Croatia. I've tried to pop some of these on a map. The ones in red are the ones that Professor D'Ayala has been involved with. The grey ones are some of the other notable ones recently. And one of the things that emerged after this challenge was the power of multiple missions. So at L'Aquila in Italy, Professor D'Ayala worked with Professor Rosetto and others on a return visit. So nearly 3 years after the event, over 3 years after the event, they were able to see that recovery was still in progress, to look at how rubble was being disposed of and the fact that shoring was still in place. And they could see the role in the reconstruction of rapid evaluation, regulations, and support for repair and rebuild. Another post-earthquake investigation was at Gorkha in Nepal, which was a larger earthquake in April 2015. And in the post-disaster recovery, it was evident that financial and technical support was significant, and that there were particular technical needs related to the stone masonry and mud mortar. So the reconstruction was informed by some of Professor D'Ayala's own previous studies looking at these forms of construction, and they were able to apply experimental and computational analysis in that context, and the recognition that much of what we need is to develop better methods that use the materials that are familiar and available in particular locations. Closer to home, a recent project has been Stormlamp. So this is looking at rock lighthouses. So the lighthouse shown here is the Bell Rock Lighthouse, which is from 1811 and wasn't part of the actual study, but is the oldest of around 20 that are still around the UK and in service. And they were designed by trial and error, and that was often fatal error, with whole lighthouses and their staff swept into the sea. And not only an emerging technology, they are now facing the forces of climate change. Sorry, they're now facing the forces of climate change. So in the Stormlamp project, Dina and her co-investigators fitted entire lighthouses with accelerometers in order to understand their behavior under loads. They developed a design wave at the extreme end of the spectrum, and they use that information to inform inspection so that those visiting the lighthouses now can do so safely and efficiently, and to help understand loads that can be applied to the design of all sorts of maritime structures. So Professor Dina D'Ayala has been an inspiration and has contributed to innovation. So she is co-director of the Epicenter at UCL, specializing in earthquake engineering. She continues to be involved in EEFIT and CSED, which is a society of civil engineers involved in earthquake engineering. She contributes to learning from earthquakes to ensure that other people understand earthquakes and can apply that knowledge to build safer structures. She's a director of the International Association of Earthquake Engineers and a fellow of the Institution of Civil Engineers, and she is the holder of patents for products designed to anchor buildings and improve their resilience to earthquakes. She really is a woman who has challenged engineering knowledge, and I would like to thank her for the inspiration she has given me in my own career and those I will be teaching on summer school. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well done. The broadband wasn't that bad, Fiona. It was great. Has anyone an immediate question?
Right.
Yeah, don't worry, Fiona.
It just keeps showing me that it's dropped out.
Yeah, but actually, no, don't worry about that. It was pretty clear. Maybe a few, but not really significant dropouts. Don't worry. So are there any immediate questions for Fiona? And I hope we can invite Dina later on to the discussion.
Oh, wow. Preparing and testing for impact of earthquakes on nuclear reactors. I remember reading the Liège report that part of the issue there was to do with nuclear reactors, but that is definitely a question that Dina would be much better placed to answer if she's willing.
Yes. Well, first of all, Fiona, thank you very much for this profile, and I think it's very complimentary. And when one is not used to look back so much, and so when you put all the strings together, it looks very nice. Thank you again. Yes, so SECED, which is the Society for Earthquake and Civil Dynamics, has also membership from the nuclear industry, and we routinely look at the events of or the impact of earthquakes on nuclear reactors, although I personally haven't actually done any work in that specific field. I don't know if that answered Kay's question.
I think it probably does. That's great. Thank you so much, Dina. I hope we can invite you later on as well to our discussion. Thank you, Fiona. Right, so I'm going to go next, if that's okay.
Thank you.
You're right, thanks. Let me share my screen, and I'm going to my PowerPoint and make it bigger for you to see. Right, so I hope that's all okay. So I'm going to talk about Dame Sarah Deed. She was named architect of curves and not angles, which I find quite interesting. I have to step back and say why. Why would I like to talk about this architect? There are loads of reasons, but I want to start with the personal ones. I think it was in 2008 when I encountered her work for the first time, and that was in the Vitra Design Museum near Basel. So this is a fire station, her very ever first built building, not used very much, but it was very impressive having had a tour through the building and being able to walk through this amazing architecture, the first ever built. And what I found was that some of the things in the building were strange. For example, I looked at a light switch for switching on different light areas in the building, and it was so confusing. I was thinking, how would you ever be able to use that? And I found it really interesting and enticing to understand more about her approach. What drives her to design these very deconstructivist buildings? And there's a near miss. I studied at the School of Design at the Polytechnic University in Hong Kong, and just after I've left, she actually built a new building where the School of Design is housed now. It's called the Innovation Tower. And my PhD supervisor, an architect himself, he was actually supervising the build from the client side. And I still haven't managed to go. And got the chance to go to Glasgow to see one of her works with the design engagement event series, where we take students to meet students in different locations, because they are all over the UK and Europe often as well. And we had a walk around and looked inside the Riverside Museum of Transport she's built. And I think there it came to me that what fascinates me about her work, her achievements, is the immersion, the way you approach a building, you take it in. It's very drawn on bringing you into an experience nearly. And when I trying to understand a bit more about her, looking back, she had an amazing biography, and unfortunately she's died a few years back very suddenly. She was born in Iraq, and quite internationally raised, studied mathematics in Iraq, but then she went to the Architectural Association in the UK, and she opened her own practice in London soon after that. She also taught at not just the Architectural Association, and she has this amazing list of achievements which baffles me, but she's Forbes' list world most powerful woman, for example. She has the Pritzker Architecture Prize, won in 2004, the Sterling Prize twice. She's called UNESCO Artist for Peace, and she was made a Dame in 2012. It's absolutely unbelievable. And I think what made her, so successful in her work, and she's actually not only built houses or amazing buildings, but she also built public spaces, furniture, footwear, cars, is that she's visionary in a sense. She doesn't let herself take away her experimental approach to building, and her ideation process, how she comes up with ideas, is often through paintings. I think her master's work at BMA was actually a massive acrylic painting exploring different spaces and how they work together. So that comes back to what I felt when I walked around and through the buildings she's built. It's this holistic experience, is moving through and exploring and seeing much more the entire picture, stepping back, and also working with abstraction. So I love this quote. Is we called her the inventor of 89 degrees. Nothing was ever 90 degrees. She had this spectacular vision, and all the buildings were exploding into tiny little pieces. And it's captivating. You feel sometimes as if you're walking into a 3D computer model when you enter her work. Another quote that's also from her former AA architect association teacher is that the way she drew a staircase, you would smash your head against the ceiling and the space was reducing and reducing. You would end up in the upper corner of the ceiling, and she couldn't care about the teeny details. Her mind was on the broader picture, and when it came to the joinery, she knew we could fix it later. It's very daring, I do think, to approach architecture in this way and to not be deterred. She had loads of big disappointments. For example, one was the Cardiff Opera. She won the competition. The jury loved her work, but the Welsh government refused to pay for it, so it wasn't built. But I think in the exhibition in 1988, she started to get some more breakthrough where people understood her constructivist architecture, the approach she's following, which works with fragmentation of the constructed building and an absence of an obvious harmony. There is harmony a lot, but it's not obvious, and as such, you need to experience it. Many people say that on paper or on the screen, you can't really experience her buildings. And often the question comes, so how do these strict structures, how are they supported? How can you build them? And that is where I kind of come back to what I got to know in Hong Kong. Lots of my teachers there worked in parametric and generative design. And I think this field has come so far in that algorithms are helping architects and engineers to maximize the structural efficiency. So you run so many models and attempts and evolutionary kind of models that you find out how you can possibly build these structures. And you also there are loads of new ways of speeding up the building process through this. And she was definitely a master of generative design, which is really amazing. And one of them, a teacher of mine at the design school in Hong Kong, he is now a director for Sarah Hadid Architects. It was unfortunately only finished after she passed away, but that's the Kaixing Airport in Beijing, a newly open airport, and it's a fascinating building. It looks a bit like a starfish from top, and interesting is that it's based on traditional Chinese courtyard architecture. So in the middle there's a massive courtyard, and it's an absolutely sustainable building. It's built on loads of renewable energy approaches, ground heat pump, rainwater collection, and because of the very compact size, it totally optimizes the way you move between the terminals, less ground transport, for example. It also uses natural skylights a lot. So it's a great compromise, or maybe not even a compromise, a great joining of vision and making it very efficient using parametric design and computational models. What I found also extremely interesting is the collaboration in architecture. The design and planning was by Sarah Did Architects, but also the French planners ADPI and Partners. The execution was by Beijing Institute of Architectural Design. The facade design was by Tian Kernwell and Beijing Institute of Architectural Design. And engineering was by Arab, by Beijing Institute of Architectural Design, China IPPR. And Bureau Harpole as well, engineering. It's amazing. It's a huge feat of making visionary design come true and be such an efficient and effective and beautiful building. One thing which is absolutely striking is that Sarah Did is the only woman ever to have won the RIBA Gold Medal of Architecture, unless we count last year's win. I found a quote that said she was not keen to be characterized as a woman architect or an Arab architect. She was just simply an architect, which is really a striking thing and makes me really think about. And yesterday I did hear about a Part W collective of engaged and proactive women. They ran a campaign to actually address the lack of recognition of achievements in women in architecture. And this one slide they presented yesterday is all the people that have won the award, the gold medal, over the how many 100 years it runs. And it was one woman who won it up until 2019. It's Saha. It's I don't know, I lose words to describe what I feel when I read that. And what I've introduced was the alternative list. It was a social media campaign where they asked women to nominate an architect from the years they could have nominated instead of a man. And that actually led to a 2010 nomination of Grafton Architects led by Yvonne Farrell and Shelley Namara to be named gold medal winner, RIBA gold medal winner last year. So I just want to thank you. I have a big question for later on in the discussions based on exactly the last point I made, but I think I'm running out of time. So I'll take a question if anyone would like to ask one. And sometimes my chat is not updating, so please dare to open your microphone. If there are no immediate questions, that's all right as well. Don't worry, we have more time for discussion later on. Okay, that's great, don't worry. So Chris, do you want to take the stage, please?
Yes.
Lovely, thank you. Don't worry. So it's yeah, very good. All perfect.
There we go. Right, now let's just make this a bit bigger. And here it comes. Now, what I'm going to talk to you about now is it's a little bit of a change, really, because we've heard a lot about women engineers, but today we're going to look at something just to wrap up this session from a slightly different angle. And what I'm going to do is talk to you about Doreen Massey just very quickly, and a reflection on what she achieved in her role as an academic. There's a nice little picture of her there. It's just I couldn't find any particularly appropriate ones, but there's a bit of a cartoon there. But the crucial thing about that is the fact it does describe in that small cartoon all the key things that she did as an academic and in her academic life. But the difficulty is, and I think I've heard this from the other presenters, is it's really quite hard to know where to start. She's extraordinarily well known at the Open University, and she was one of the first people that, when I started my degrees, that I really got to know about in terms of the academic field. She was fiercely committed to the Open University, which in 1982 appointed her a Professor of Geography. Now, that's no small feat in itself. What the key things were that she focused on, though, were space, place, capital, and power. And that was an integral part of everything that she wrote and everything that she researched and focused on. And the curious thing is that we've all been talking about space, really, where you build things. But in fact, she looked at things in a very slightly different way. She viewed space as a pincushion of 1,000,000 stories. And she went on to say, if you stop at any point in that walk, there will always be a house with a story. So every single building, everything that we see has got something to tell us. She was very active in social movements and had quite significant left-wing politics. And when you read a bit more about her work, it wasn't what she knew, it's what she didn't know, and not who she knew, but who she didn't know. But amongst all that, she was a pioneer of feminist geography. Now, this was at a time when feminism was really taking off and the role of women in the academic field was suddenly coming to the fore. So she started off with that kind of view, but in fact, prior to that, she'd done an awful lot of regional development, which I hadn't really fully appreciated until I started digging into her work a little bit more deeply. And the other thing that I found out about her, which completely floored me, was that she was a passionate Liverpool fan. I have absolutely no idea why, and I don't mean to offend any Liverpool fans in the audience, but anyway, that's another little snippet. But what she challenged, and this is where I really did come into this, because at the time that I got into this, I'd come into the academic world, and this really did grab my interest, because what she was doing was she was challenging traditional Western thinking. Now, these days, when you stand where we are now, we are in sort of quite a positive position. But if you look back to when all this was kicking off, sort of in the 80s, it was a very, very different world. And what she did was that she challenged traditional Western thinking, and she challenged that there was masculinity associated with politics and progress. It's not to say that she was an out and out feminist, but she was very much involved in putting forward women's careers and women academic careers in particular. And what she also noticed was that women were linked with stability and place-boundedness. So what we're talking about is that they had no space. They didn't have any space to go. They could not expand any of their particular thoughts. So what happened after that? She's got thinking along those lines. Then she wrote this book. It's called Space, Place and Gender. And that was a truly seminal work. Now, I looked at that, and that was the time when I sort of bumped into her. And it was like, wow, this is just absolutely, truly amazing. And I couldn't believe how much it was telling me. You know, I went back to it the other day because I was just looking at this, and the book now looks so really, really dated. But in fact, that's rather nice in a way, because that means how much further forward we've moved on. But anyway, it was very, very important at the time. But crucially, and this is where we're coming, where gender and women fit, and where we design all these different buildings, is that she looked at the design of space and place, and she realized that how important they were in the construction of gender relations. And of course, what you have are these symbolic places with all kinds of designs, where homes are designed to reflect male-female roles. And there are loads of gendered messages, like, oh, she's in the kitchen, the kitchen is her space, that kind of thing. And it also confined women to the domestic sphere, a woman's place. When all of those, mercifully, are a bit in the past now, and that's where I have every intention for it to stay. But she was also extraordinarily vocal as an academic. Now, the curious thing is that she was very objective about herself, because one of the arguments that she came up with is that feminist geographers, and that was including herself, she argued that women had been written out of the landscape. Now, that's really, really interesting, because she was taking an objective and a critical view of her own approach to writing about feminist geography, because she could see that there were times when women were actually not included. And so she was realizing that feminist scholarship had been ignored. But she was not exactly backward in coming forward, and she had a very, very powerful response to this. And she which was supported by direct and very angry language about flexible sexism. Because that's when you can with flexible sexism is whether you either accept it or you don't, you either use it or you don't use it. So it's sort of not a constant, if you like. What she said was that these arguments therefore go beyond feminism to link up with issues of other groups, most particularly ethnic minorities and those from non-Western societies. In the end, it is argued consigning these groups to parentheses after the supposed universal of the white male heterosexual. Now that in itself, that was something that she wrote in 1991, and that has immense resonance to exactly where we are today. Now, curiously, she did have a lot of links with design and looking at things about building and construction, because very early in her career, she was a member of the Centre for Environmental Studies, and she was focused on planning and design of physical spaces. Now, that really did actually quite take me by surprise, because I had no idea quite how influential she was. And what she did was she looked at urban development models through a regional science approach. Now, in common, I think, with some of these other people that we've heard about this evening, is that she took a very much a bigger picture approach. And what she did was that she didn't look at this in just sort of single design, small areas, but what she did was she looked at things, at how you could shape a region. And what she did was to look at the role and how to reshape geographical and regional unevenness. Because of course, you know, as we all know, that some areas, some regions in the UK have more money, more housing, less housing, better jobs than others. But that's the kind of view that she was taking in terms of design and how regions were shaped as a consequence of these kinds of disparities. And the curious thing is that very much of this time was based on using models. Now, if you've ever looked at models along these times, they're very, very factual, very, very quantitative, and very, very focused, if you like, on how they were written. There's no flexibility of language. Anyway, I picked this bit up from an article that was written, jointly written by her and another person in 1971, which is very much a sign of the times because of the way it was written. And this was a quote, and it says, the work of this group was designed to enable planners to get away from the old concept of development plans as it being essentially maps of land allocation. Now, I think actually you'll probably get the gist of this more if you read this in a kind of BBC tone of voice, because that's the way it's written. Anyway, to carry on, this approach had come to be seen as lacking in policy discussion and as being an inadequate framework for debate. The maps were often too detailed for inspection of policy by the ministry, yet insufficient in detail for design purposes at a local level. That's this last paragraph, this last sentence that I find the most interesting. Moreover, they did not enable transport and land use plans to be developed in an integrated way and rarely gave any indication of the social and economic implications of the proposed plan. And to me, that just goes to show that how far we've come since those days and how much more inclusive we are in all forms of and different members of society. Now, I haven't got a quote for the fourth space because that was the last of the book that she wrote in 2005. But if you compare that quote to the language of the following one, it's just completely, it's written like it's written by two different people. It's quite interesting to see. But just wrapping this up now is that Massey did carry on with her early design roots, which it sort of filtered through to all of her work. And she did do a project, I think it was in 2003. And what she did was she looked at the early design routes with a critique of science parks. And by this point, I mean, it's like by this point in her career, she was settled and she could really be quite forthright in what she thought. So this particular quote comes from her in a typically forthright fashion. She said, "It is argued that science parks are founded on a notion of scientific production and industrial innovation, which is not only technically inappropriate, but also intrinsically socially divisive. Moreover, the spatial form and symbolic spatial content of science parks, close to higher education, separated from physical production and with specific design characteristics, further increases their tendency to promote and depend upon social polarization." So she had very, very strong roots, very strong views about how things were designed, and especially about, and this does reflect on her early design roots. But ultimately, what she was a passionate believer in the concept of space. And that's everything that's around us, what we put in it, how we live in it, and how we design it. And the interesting way is that how she looked at things, that's kind of philosophy in a way, was that she saw space as a container for everyday life, which I think is a really wonderful way of looking at things. But that doesn't exist in isolation, but is the product of interrelations. So it's how we all work together to create and produce and design all these different spaces. And also the point she was also making is that everything in these designs, these concepts, these different spaces, it's always under construction in every sense of the word. Now, just a few takeaway points from this. I didn't come into academia through a traditional route. And by the time I got here, Doreen Massey was just starting off with this, with the feminist approach. And her influence on me was absolutely profound as a student and as a subsequent academic. And what she did for me is to show that how spaces and places reflect so much that we don't even think about. And what she was pointing out, I think, is that we take so much for granted, and perhaps we shouldn't. We should reflect on how these particular images, how these buildings have been designed, and they've been built, constructed, and a part of our everyday lives. Mainly, she showed that space and place can reflect struggle because it's always contested. It can show inequality, power, and subordination. But most of all, she showed that there is a moral and ethical dimension in all that we do, and that there is a right and there is a wrong way to go about things. And for me, that's the powerful legacy that Doreen Massey left us. And that's me done. Any questions? I'd be happy to take them.
Seems like there are no immediate questions, but it's the perfect, I think, for me, this kind of links back to the first talk we heard in a way. I don't know how you feel about that, Miguel, but it's about very much, you know, I mean, the diagram was really striking about who's, you know, giving the first domino push and in order to kind of evolve. And I think, you know, it's about the power relationship and maybe also, you know, who's going to have a say in that and who's not. So
I agree, and about stories, if I may, because I seem to remember Doreen Massey was the one who said that space is a multiplicity of stories so far. You have to understand the stories that happen in place, and it is very important who is the one who is allowed to tell their stories, whose voices are amplified, which is the point that Flor Avelino was making as well. And speaking a bit about stories, I have a bit of a question, although I don't know if it's going to be too specific, but I am thinking about Doreen Massey and space making in the context of the Oxford to Cambridge arc. I don't know if you are familiar with that one, because you mentioned the attempts to create a region, and right now there are many authorities trying to create a region, Oxford to Milton Keynes to Cambridge, and it is creating a story about innovation, about the new Silicon Valley. And in a way, I wonder if that's going to echo with themes about creating spaces that are divisive in a way, about creating spaces that become in some way a big space, a big cluster, a big research cluster. So I don't know, maybe my question is, do you consider that planners are still paying attention to the wisdom of Doreen Massey, or that it still has been incorporated into our ways of thinking, or it's something that we still have to keep building, keep fighting for? So we need to keep fighting. I think that's the message we get, or that's what I am seeing in the chat.
It's really interesting looking at the different perspectives. I think one of the things for me is just been how everyone else's talks has also touched on things I've been involved with. So we had one of the Zaha Hadid projects that didn't get built in the office at Arup in Bristol, and trying to do reinforcement detailing with everything at 89 degrees is a nightmare. It's sort of so. But again, we never got to test it in reality. So it is that thing of understanding the environment and the specifics of it. So the Oxford and Cambridge Art project, they've had to, is one of the pathway projects for flood resilience, because they're trying to understand the flood dynamics of a plan that cuts across catchments and across different geological and fluvial geomorphology regions. So it all sort of it interweaves, and we've got this whole web of knowledge that isn't necessarily getting connected up, because we've developed a very departmental structure, haven't we, with somebody in charge of everything, which means that nobody's seeing those bigger pictures that really are what delivers in design.
Yeah. That's what I felt with the last example, the airport that was recently finished. I mean, the teamwork, and I haven't even, that was only the terminal building to collaborators on. It expands to the transport going into Beijing, the local business and regional development as well. And I think a quote there really struck me as well as about the development of the approach of Saradid architects as well. That initially, as I said, the first building was not actually really usable. It was still the dream. It was still the CAD model. You know, it was still the painting. But the Beijing International Airport is absolutely mega usable, but still has this flow, this vision in it. So I think it takes so long to come to this point where you are able to still express what you wanted to feel like, but it's buildable. It includes the regional development. It tells stories about space, and yeah, it's just building up the expertise and being able to collaborate across, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think also just that knowledge of who's there to inspire us.
Yes.
And sharing those stories and those links so that we can inspire others and keep making links ourselves.
That's why I like the alternative list example. It's just retelling a different story or just creating a story, and it had such an influence. You know, it really made Reba look elsewhere. Unbelievable for how many years that didn't happen. Would anyone like to come in and ask a question, please?
I just had a comment that as much as I love Zaadid buildings, from an earthquake engineering point of view, they are just a nightmare.
Oh,
they are not buildings, they are structures that are pinpointed, so they will never stand up. But also, unfortunately, in order to engineer them according to current standards, they very quickly become unsustainable and yes, very expensive. So, and I think that that's the direction in which people should work really. How do you free your, the imagination and the ability to work against gravity, but still maintain the sustainability agenda.
Good point.
So we are going back to the first profile.
Yeah. And that's probably the younger generation, the upcoming generation.
Exactly.
Yes,
exactly.
I like that. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you again for this presentation. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions, please? Dare to speak up. Be curious. Ask.
It would be wonderful to draw a web between the four people we spoke about.
Yeah.
So I feel a bit like a sort of lost spider at the moment. It's sort of because there's sort of I've realised I've worked with somebody who worked with Doreen Massey as well. So sort of, oh my goodness, it all links up. And I've obviously got one one inspiration to take away and do some more reading on.
Yeah, yeah. No, definitely, yeah.
Yeah, she was a really interesting woman. I mean, quite honestly, as I'm sure you found the same, that I just didn't, all this was just scratch the surface. Because no matter what you did in terms of planning feminism, no matter what, that she just appeared, and I thought, I'm never going to get to the bottom of this. And all I've done is just scratch. It's just it's a shame, really, because there's obviously so much more to know about these people. They've influenced us. For me, from the absolute word go, and I've never forgotten it. You know, the first book that I read, it's a very powerful thing, that of hers, not the Janet and John books, but the first book that I read of hers was just, it was for me, it just like opened the doors.
Yeah, there's certainly some very interesting things looking at these different scales, aren't there? Is sort of right down from large scale design all the way down to reinforcement detailing.
Yeah.
It's sort of, and how do we make that all work together? And we make decisions that are in aid of sustainability at one scale and find that we've completely messed it up at another.
Yeah.
It's sort of all that concrete to make these spaces. So we need to make spaces in the mind, not in the physical world.
True.
Yeah, it's kind of like lateral thinking in a way, isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Did we find it easy to choose someone to talk about? I actually had a list of 4 that I gave Nicole. And
It was rather hard. Yeah, I think for me it went because I had this strong experience when I entered her buildings, and I always wanted to understand a bit more. So it was a personal drive and just uncovering certain things, you know, just trying to understand someone deeper. Yeah, no, I had several as well.
I think for me it's also very much that we need to celebrate people whilst they're working or have recently been working. We spend so much time looking at we're just swapping dead men for dead women and who we're celebrating, and that doesn't actually necessarily help us to build our own careers and face our own challenges. That we need people who are a few paces ahead of us, not those of us from centuries before.
Yeah.
I agree with Fiona, and that's why it was easy for me to think who did I want to talk about. I think that it is good to have a balance because we have to, well, we are standing on the shoulders of giants. I also work a lot with the ideas of Doreen, and for me it is good to have some inspiration, somebody who made it in, we have to say, at time when it was very, very difficult to break the glass ceiling, but also acknowledge people who are still fighting that, people who are still struggling today, who are breaking paths today. And I feel that today there was a very nice balance of people who fought the hard fight and won, and people who are still making their way.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, it's a good point, Miguel.
Yeah. I'd love to hear from our guests, please.
And somebody posted online the question if she has done work on social aspects of environmentalist. And yes, she's looking very much into how to get communities to take the lead in social transformation, in social technical transformation projects, because that's one of her big points, that when we start thinking of how are we going to change the environment, we don't have to sit and talk with Elon Musk, because he will make himself heard, that's for sure. He said that instead we have to create a space where the voices of the community can be protected, can be swayed, can be heard, and can be empowered. I mean, will not be swayed because it is, she complains much about empowering exercises that become disempowering. We get everybody in the community to come and listen to the academics, to the intelligent people, to the business people, and oh yes, you little communities, we're going to listen to you, and then we are going to do whatever we wanted to do in the first place. Or that's what Flor Avelino says. And she says that we pretend that's empowering, and it becomes disempowering. Everybody becomes disillusioned. And then she said that to really change society, we have to create protected spaces, when we don't allow the voices of the big people to drown out the voices of the people who actually have to live there with the consequences of the decisions. So yes, she has done a lot of work about the social side of the transition, about bringing people.
That's great. Reminds me a lot of work I read in co-designing with communities, and I do in Mexico as well. It's really difficult to include, or actually to give communities the driving to help them drive it. Yes, go ahead, Fiona.
Another question, I think, for Miguel on particular
please.
papers.
Yeah, I can't see the chat, so please.
So any particular papers or books involving this to look into? So I don't know whether Claire Middleton wants to confirm that that's about Flor Avelino.
It is, yes, please.
If I may abuse Nicole's patience, can we circulate our slides, and can I include a better bibliography in mine?
No
Off the top of my head, I'm not going to remember the right titles, the right references, but I will send them with my slides.
Yes. That's.
And I would like to get everyone else's slides, if I may abuse everyone else's patience as well, the other presenters.
I think, Rachel, you have a hand up.
Yeah, just a quick. Well, firstly, a thank you to everybody. It was really interesting and lovely to hear about such a range, and like we've talked about in terms of scale and people that have achieved and people that are more on that journey. So it was great to kind of get that range of discussion and hear about different people. But a quick question for Miguel, really, in terms of you talked about Flor Avelino's impact that she's had in such a short time from when she completed her PhD to where she is now, and the impact over a period of about 10 years. And I just wondered what you thought were the key factors in having that level of success. You know, are the key determinants from the work that Flor's doing, but also about where we are at a time in society, I guess.
I think that's exactly the thing, the time at society. There had been people talking about those issues before, but maybe the time was not right for people to realize that this was a concern. This was 2010 or so, when people were started to really worry about the low carbon society, when people were talking in very idealistic terms about the transition to low carbon. And I think that she just happened to collect all the concerns of different authors at that time, when people were realizing that green was not necessarily good. I think that just she happened to say, crystallize what was already ready to happen in a moment when it was getting large in the policy agenda and in people's minds. Or maybe I am projecting myself, because this came at the time when I was struggling with those issues personally. So that's why it was impactful for me, because I had for a long time assumed that green was good. And then I realized that different people had different agendas for what green, what sustainable could be, and different versions of the sustainable future had different winners and losers. And well, that was my personal journey at the moment, but I think it was something that society was going through at the moment. And she just crystallized it very clearly, very concisely at the right time, which I guess it's important for every academic to be with the spirit of the era.
Yeah, thanks, Miguel. Yeah, I think right time, right place, but I can imagine that there have also been other people that have been in the right place at the right time and not had that level of success. So I think that's you know, quite interesting that she's had the impact that she has.
Yes, and for me that came from clarity of writing and strength of ideas. I found her very accessible when I was just a green PhD student. And I guess that's always important, to write in a way that people will understand, particularly when you are writing about organizing people. When she is writing things like a manifesto for social change, And when you're writing a manifesto that is meant to change communities, it has to be at a level that communities can appreciate and be inspired by, I feel.
Yeah, thanks, Miguel. So it's the method of communication as well as then by the sounds of it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there any other question? I can't see the chat, so if there is one in the chat, then someone else pick it
No,
up.
I don't think there's nothing else in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of people have said thank you, and they've gone now. So.
I know, yeah. So we are actually over. I was wondering if there's just one more question, but I do think that's probably us for this evening. We had quite a journey through a time and space, I feel. It was great. I'm really inspired. I'm definitely going to look up some of the stuff that I've heard today. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And I think we should do that again.
Not just yet, eh?
Okay. Yeah, so everyone, thanks a lot for coming, and have a lovely evening. Enjoy the evening.
I will. Bye.
Okay.
Oh, I forgot my camera. No,
Bye.
hang on.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. I'm sure we'll all speak again, and we'll sort out the slides.
Yes.
Okay. Bye. Bye. All. I'm going to go and have my dinner now.